Okay, like I said, this is going to be very informal. What I've done is I've just pulled a few things together that were of interest. I went through the newspaper myself. I went through some of Don's stuff. I went through a lot of the history books. And the Candor Courier. I found a lot of interesting things in it. I wanted to start off by saying the 1930s. President Hoover started off the decade by signing the tariff bill on Tuesday, June 24th, 1930, with the new duties going into effect at midnight that night. In Candor, school centralization was about to get underway. It had been arranged by Kenneth O. Ward, president of the school board, to have Frank Wood, an expert in centralizing schools in New York, address a meeting of the taxpayers of Candor on the subject on June 26th. It wasn't, though, until the end of the decade that the schools finally centralized in 1939. During the 1930s, I found it interesting that the annual school tax collected was $5 on 1,000. Not a whole lot. Other concerns of the day in Candor centered on situations that might seem similar today. The following is taken from the January 16, 1930 Candor Courier. Here are two questions often asked by residents of towns like Candor. What is the difference between a How does one community earn the reputation of being enterprising while another is called stagnant? Both towns may look the same and both have the same natural advantages, yet one has the reputation of being dead and the other alive. As we see it, the difference lies in the attitude of the citizens themselves. A live town is one in which there are plenty of men and women ready to take hold and put over a worthy community enterprise. And a dead town is one in which every man is too selfishly engrossed in his own affairs to spend any time on community matters. That answers both questions. Now you fit the answers to your individual efforts and see if you don't notice an improvement in your own community before 1930 has run its course. And they say the answer looking back seems to be that Candor was a town of action, not only in business, but in community service and the welfare of its people. Compared to the 1930s, not much has changed over the years, really. I wrote this in 1997. In 2002, Candor is still a town of action, evident by its many businesses, school, churches, community organizations, youth programs, and the many volunteers that make it all happen. I guess the old adage is true, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Some of the interesting tidbits that I found along the way. The New York Motor Vehicle Financial Responsibility Act had just gone into effect in 1929, and J.H. Jennings Jr., the local insurance agent, capitalized on the insurance of not only an automobile policy, but one that would also protect your home against sheriff's sale, your bank account against attachment, and your salary against garnishment. In Catawba, St. Francis Roman Catholic Church had its beginnings when Polish residents of Owego and Candor banded together and held services, services were held originally at the home of Mr. and Mrs. M. Nagel in Catawba during 1929 until the church was built in 1930 and dedicated in November that year. In September, the editor of the Courier says, I'm used to the more modern idea of dancing, and while years ago I lived as a kid in Candor, I remember the squares and the fun they had, meaning square dances. And in those days it was considered the workings of the devil to be able to shake a foot. Now things have changed, and the dance is and can be one of the most beautiful ways of passing the lonely evenings. And with such a splendid floor as the little hall has, and the evident decent atmosphere created by the host warden, it would be a downright shame if this little institution could not go on as one of Candor's most cherished civic benefits. The young people of Candor are a fine bunch of youngsters who need a great deal more thought for their amusement than they are getting from us older ones. In August of that year, 1930, the Booth Farm, one of the largest, if not the largest real estate deal consummated in the town of Candor for many years, took place when Mr. Corwin of Jamaica, Long Island, purchased the Booth Farm between Candor and Wilseyville. The new owners had already taken possession. The deal consisted of all the land, stock, crops, and machinery. The consideration was around $30,000. Bert Reed, who has managed the farm for several years, removed to Binghamton where he had a position in a steel company. The Civil Conservation Corps camps, and I'll just mention this briefly, because Milt's going to be doing a talk on that. Is that in October?
July.
July, this is in July. It was opened by the second half of the decade, and soil erosion service work began. Tioga County's campsite was in Candor at Straits Corner, and eventually, after their initial work was complete, was given the job of surveying farmers' woodlots to record the different species of trees that were in an 8-mile radius of the campsite, thus thinking to give the farmers that were thinking to form a forest products marketing association an increased bargaining power, and they did form one. Also in 1930, Charles Marshall's Texaco building was taken down by Harold Strong to build a small barn where the Candor car wash is now. Marshall then built a new garage and service station with plenty of room for his radio sales and service where Judy's Loft is. Superintendent Allen and a force of men began work on the new Macadam Street to be built by the village from the corner of Main and Owego Streets to the corporation line at the cemetery. The stone for the base was 12 inches thick, well rolled and topped with a coating of oil and crushed stone. In 1935, the Spencer Candor Road was opened to traffic on October 1. Only construction of shoulders remained to be completed, as all bridge construction work was finished at that time. The new town building was built on Rich Street in 1931. The building was 100 feet high and rested on a concrete foundation about 3 feet deep, and was considered large enough to store all the town's machinery at that time. The town ball team in the early years of the decade still held its position at the bottom of the league, standing by a safe margin. Thought that was interesting. In 1935, the ballpark bequeathed by John McCarty was built. Besides talk of war and current events around the world, radios, so good it needed no aerial, were the hot item of the day, especially the wonderful silver radio sold by C.W. Marshall at the Keystone Garage for $173. Well, that's quite a chunk of money. Or the new Edison Light-O-Matic, which sold for $167. E.H. Risley had the Zenith automatic radio for $175. That was the most expensive. And due to the success of the radio in Candor, complaints of the demise of parlor organs were a major complaint in the family home and newspaper. And they quote, "It is just another example of changing times and changing customs, more proof of the fact that nothing in this old world is permanent." On the health side, measles and whooping cough were prevalent and health concerns were everywhere. In 1931, the Tioga County General Hospital was underway, and within the first 10 days of opening had 51 admissions. 9 of them were for major surgical operations. Dr. W.A. Moulton and Dr. Eugene D. Holly were both physicians and surgeons in Candor, and both had an office on Main Street. In the latter part of the decade, Dr. John Jakes and his wife came to town and set up practice. For animal care, Arnold E. Hilbert, BVM, was the man to see, and you could reach him on the telephone by dialing 12A. Businesses. Candor was quite a busy place. In 1931, electricity came to Wilseyville, and toward the end of the decade, the Candor Telephone Company began their 24-hour service on their 98 miles of line. Local businesses in town included The Hub, a clothing and gents furnishing store located next to the courier office. They carried a complete line of men's suits for $12.50. The Grand Union grocery store was located in the post office building, and it was managed by Carl Hauslander. The A&P had been established in 1859, and both shops sold coffee for 19 cents a pound, 2 pounds of butter for 95 cents, and you could purchase 5 cans of evaporated milk for 39 cents. Next to the A&P was Baker's Drug Store, formerly the Candy Shop. F.G. Miller and Son had a furniture and undertaking business, and Warden Van Scoy operated the feed service. H.S. Brink sold Arctic boots, and Jake Haig purchased the Candor Auto Company. Mrs. F.R. Perkins sold silk dresses, 2 for $6. While Edgar Raish sold the new Massey Harris No. 6 rake bar hay loader at his establishment. The Weber Sisters Art Shop had greeting cards, girls' shorts, sizes 6 to 20, and girls overhaul, size 3 to 8. The special sale of white hats at Edna C. Wentworth's and Betty's Beauty Shop graduation special of perms for only $3.50, regularly $5. I think they cost about $50 these days. Druggist Carl L. Baker sold his Candor cut rate drugstore and soda fountain at 83 Main Street to Elmer G. Kilpatrick. Baker continued to take care of the prescription department. The building is now owned by Will Overback and is being restored. The Cookie Jar restaurant at Hubbardtown received a large addition. Later, about 125 members of Ithaca's Westminster Choir were served a specially prepared dinner, greatly adding to A.M. Morey's reputation as a gourmet chef. And in 1937, the Brush and Pal hosted the Cornell University football team and members of the press at a turkey dinner. M.V. Van de Bogart's store was burglarized of a large quantity of ladies' hosiery, sweaters, men's woolen socks, gloves, razor blades, and cigars in 1937. There are many other businesses in the Candor area, such as C.N. Robinson, H.S. Brink, L.G. Asenauer, who owned the Red and White at that time, Van de Bogart, D.G. LaGrange, Edna Wentworth, and Miss Dorothea Dennis, who owned the Cozy Corner Inn, but none of such importance as the Candor Glove Factory. And I do have a few highlights only because it was really going pretty strong in the 1930s. It changed hands, keeping the same business name. It wasn't unusual, for the company to receive orders from the government for 1,000 dozen pairs of gloves, 1,000 dozen pair of gloves, not 1,000 gloves, but 1,000 dozen pair of gloves, which was taken in competition with a large number of the other manufacturers for the bid. There were other glove companies in the area at that time as well. I think North Valley, I'm not sure whether, I think Owego might have had one at the time, I'm not sure. But I think there was another one somewhere. To expand their business, the factory began manufacturing ladies' leather jackets as a means of keeping the help employed. These jackets were made up in assorted colors of leather and were lined with a Scotch plaid with a matching scarf or throw and a beret or cap of the same material. The Candor Glove Company had been in operation for 40 years at that time and was a leading industry in Candor, becoming known in every state of the Union into which their goods had been shipped. They carried on their books the largest and best-known firms of the United States, such as DuPont Company, U.S. Steel, Western Union Telegraph Company, Western Electric, Associated Gas and Electric, large coal mining and steel mining companies as well. The factory had a well-established foreign trade, selling to England, South America, West Africa, and the Hawaiian Islands. I just have a short quip here on the railroad. The railroad, having been one of the main transportation of goods to and from Candor, was starting to have problems in the 30s. The Lehigh Valley Railroad actually abandoned its line through West Candor and Wilseyville to Ithaca. The phrase "Stop, Look, and Listen" was instituted as a safety-first campaign of the railroads to eliminate the appalling, quote, "and unnecessary sacrifice of life and limb at railroad crossings." Now, there were many organizations in Candor also. They included numerous church groups. The Onika tribe, number 348 of the Improved Order of the Red Man, which met every Friday evening in the Red Men's Hall. Candor Grange was a thriving organization, as was the Candor Home Bureau, Community Club, Veritas Lodge of the Odd Fellows, and the Candor Civic Center. The men's club president was Edgar Raish, and the Candor Rifle Club competed with other communities, including Binghamton. There were various ladies' aid societies and auxiliaries in the Willowdale Rebecca Lodge. Both the Free and Accepted Masons and the Eastern Star were prevalent. Candor's Boy Scout Troop 42 was organized in the early part of the decade, and Charles Keene Ward became Candor's first Eagle Scout in 1938. A Girl Scout troop was formed in 1937, and one of Candor's 3 book clubs, the Cirrhosis Book Club, was founded by Mrs. Edgar Vanscoy. Candor Rokai Club held meetings in Candor School Auditorium, holding a clam bake in August. There were 64 paid members at that time. And the Alpha Hose and Chemical Company rivaled the Alert Hose Company and finally merged into one in the 1930s. But one of the more prominent and outspoken organizations was that against bootlegging and intoxicants. They must have had the heyday in the 1930s. The Women's Christian Temperance Union. Prohibition was in effect in the early years and was repealed in 1933 with the 21st Amendment. Candor was a dry town until the latter part of the decade when it was voted in as a wet town. Still, the Women's Christian Temperance Union membership was strong in Candor under the DeWitt chapter. News of the organization was prevalent on a weekly basis, including arrests of local citizens for alleged violations of the Prohibition Act on places such as the old New York House. The organization held annual picnics, mother-daughter events, attended conferences, and regular meetings were held at homes or churches. Speakers from as far away as Scotland, such as Mrs. Helen Barton on behalf of the Presbyterian Church of Scotland and a member of the Glasgow Parish Council, attended conventions to speak and share their concerns and efforts. The director of the Federal Alcohol Administration said that the old saloon should not return. He quotes, "Maybe not by name," he stated, "but call it a tavern, a grill, anything else you please, and what's the difference?" After the repeal, the first license for beer and wine was granted in 1935 to the owners of the White Elephant, the former Johnson Stone Hall. And I'm not sure what it's called today. It was the Village Bar
Well,
and
it was
Grill.
Sidelines the last I
Sidelines.
knew, but I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's Sidelines now.
Still.
I know, I don't keep up, you know, they're always changing.
Closed.
Somebody,
Oh, it's closed now.
Closed, yeah. Closed.
temporarily, somebody else
Okay.
is bought it.
By mid-1930s, the WCTU, which is the Women's Christian Temperance Union, was still in force when 99 mothers and daughters attended the WCTU Mother and Daughter Banquet that May. It was an interdenominational organization, and the invitations were always extended to the entire community. The group maintained an alcohol education fund and raised money to educate the youth in the community on the abstinence of liquor as a poison and a narcotic. In 1935, the town, although predicted to vote dry, voted to be a wet community. In 1938, Fred Embody opened the Mill Street Inn. Going back to the beginning of the decade, the manager of Candor Theater, after a term of nearly 20 years of showing pictures of the quality which was the best the various studios produced, had decided that Maurice Chevalier, is that how you say his name, in Innocents of Paris, on the coming Saturday night will be the last picture to be shown. The excessive cost of film service with a none too liberal patronage had made it impossible to continue any longer. However, in going through the papers, it was still going on sporadically for many, many years.
He couldn't give it up.
And I think that was it. It was just hanging in there. This was just such a cute little quip from December 25th, Christmas Day actually, 1930, that I thought it would be interesting just to see how it was written. And this is Brothers of the Nika Tribe, 348. On the second sleep of cold moon, January 2, Guy V. Vinton, Director of Organization Department, Rochester, will visit Onika. There is business of vital importance to the tribe's existence to be discussed. It is important that each brother be present to look after their business. Corn and venison will be served. Please make plans to give this great chief a royal welcome by your presence around the council fire. I just thought that was interesting. Crowley's Milk Company of Binghamton took over the Wilseyville plant in 1931. Crowley's Producers Cooperative Association, Inc. announced that the basic price of milk delivered to Crowley's Milk Company for the month of May 1938 would be $1.42 per sea weight.
100.
Is that 100?
100
weight?
100 pounds.
Okay,
That's what a can, one can.
gotcha.
40 quarts?
40 quarts.
40 quarts.
And that was for milk testing 3.5% butter fat.
Mhm.
So if it didn't test that, you would get that.
Get less.
And Harry Van Voris purchased a new Ford truck to be used on his milk route in Fairfield. In 1939, the Dairy Farms Union formed a milk strike at a mass meeting on the Borden's lawn, the Grange Hall being too small at that time. Hecklers, argument, and accusations prevailed. Crowley producers held a meeting in Wilseyville and voted to continue delivering milk at $2 per
100
pound weight. Is
Yeah.
that
Just 100 weight.
100
weight? Or 100 weight.
CWT.
Maxwell Dairy installed pasteurizing equipment and sold both grade A pasteurized and grade A raw milk. In the 1930s, Candor's 4th of July celebrations were infrequent due to the lack of organizations supporting the event. In 1930, no celebration was attempted at all. There were 2 ball games, however, Candor versus Spencer. And from my comment in the very beginning, Candor, I don't think, won. In 1932, a meeting of several businesses and representatives of organizations met at Miller's store where they decided that Candor should have a big celebration that year. Old Home Day, 4th of July committees were formed. It was reported that curbs lined bumper to bumper with cars, marching bands, color guards, horse-drawn floats, some pulled by cars with 27 antique cars on the show. The first prize float was a reproduction of the first steam engine and train to pass over the Cayuga and Susquehanna Railroad. And it was built by Albert Weber for the Baptist Church entry. Mayor C. Paul Ward gave the address of welcome from the bunting draped platform. Helen Craig read the Declaration of Independence, and the band played America. Dinner was at the Grange Hall and served about 400 people. There was an evening band concert drama that night. In 1933, the event was combined with the Firemen's Inspection, Old Home Day, and the 4th celebration, and the March of Progress parade was a huge success. Between 1934 and 36, spirits were high, and the event was a success each year. However, in 1937, the parade and crowds were diminished, and in 1938, it was a quiet celebration in Candor as many went to Oswego's Sesquicentennial celebration instead. After that, there was no big celebration until 1945. And then I have some last little tidbits to share. In 1937, the annual Polish picnic was held on Peters and Wojcicki's Fairfield Farm, now the farm of Robert Darling Howland. The First National Bank of Candor was the oldest national bank, having organized in 1863, shortly after the National Banking Act was passed. And in 1937, George Hart was elected to succeed himself, as was Vice President J.H. Jennings. In 1938, there was a full gospel mission church, a Pentecostal tabernacle, built on number 10 Smith Street, which is now the home of the Naughtons, I believe. And in 1939, the newly formed Candor Fire District was approved by the state comptroller and issued $8,000 in bonds to buy a pumper truck. C.A. Marshall ran an excursion to the World's Fair in New York City, leaving Candor July 25th and returning on the 29th. The summer was very dry that year, and Ward and Vanscoy took the opportunity to work at stopping every leak they could in the lower dam, which was wooden, to get enough water for the grist mill. There were several serious fires that year that was sparked by the locomotives along the rail. And then I thought I would end by just telling you the town officials of the day. The town office, W.E. Elmendorf. Town clerk, C.A.B.B. Justices of the Peace, C.N. Robinson, Walter Dennis, Ralph Estelle, Edmund McIntyre. Superintendent of Highway was A.R. Hills. Assessors, B.E. Johnson, Len Newman, Edward Storm. Collector was Roy B. Hayner. School directors, Homer F. Brown and W. Earl Tucker. Attendance officer was W.H. Hover. Welfare officer was C.D. Fessenden. Dog warden was E.W. Frost. And constables were F.E. Dewey, Kenneth Doty, W.E. Frost, Chaz Gray, and Harold Weber. Now, if anybody has anything they want to add to that.
You might want to change the height of the town barn.
Well, I thought 100 feet sounded kind of
It was the length,
That was the length?
not the height.
Okay, well, that must have been a misprint.
Also, you
Thank
couldn't dial 128. You had to call the operator.
Yeah, you rang the operator.
Yeah.
To get 12A.
Yeah,
No.
Ask Nina Brown to do it for you.
yeah.
And she might listen.
She might tell you they just went back to the post office.
Yes, right. Well, they're not there. There's no sense in ringing them because they're not there.
Make the fire, Candor Fire Company. They may have talked about it.
I'm sure they did.
They've talked about it ever since they were formed, I guess, but nothing was done until 57.
Is the Booth Farm, is that where Homestar is now? I thought that was it.
There's several Booth farms up there.
Oh.
Or, big one there. That's one. Huizinga, plus the one next, up the valley there, that was the Booth Farm.
There was 3 or 4 booth
Yeah.
farms. Well, Homestar, that was.
That was
Orange blue.
Horse.
Orange.
Orange?
Orange.
Yeah.
Forest, I think, where the Halstead, Halstead's place is the Booth place. And Brown Robinson's.
Must have been a bunch of them.
Yeah, they were industrious people.
Matter of fact, the family that went over to Elmira, that did the chocolates, and then they had Ivy Booth as part of the Booth family from here.
Oh, the plumbers.
Yes, they were very big in Elmira, they contacted me.
Oh.
And, through, I think, the historian, I haven't actually talked to him.
We used to buy stuff at the mill.
We bought stuff for our house. I never connected.
Did you come across anything relating to white-tailed deer?
I did, but I can't remember whether it was in the 1930s or not, but there was some mention about,
Because that was,
seeing deer.
they first started
39.
discussing an open season on white-tailed deer
In the
early in the
30s?
decade, and almost everybody was against it. The farmers were against it, even the sportsmen were against it.
Really?
And then, through the 10-year period, as the white-tailed deer population just kept expanding, and I think it was 1940 was the first year you could shoot white-tailed deer illegally.
Well, yeah, when I was doing this, I was also researching some other things, so I did run across some things, but I'm not sure what.
Yeah, the sighting of the deer made the newspapers.
Yes, yeah.
Well, that was in the 20s. In the 20s, it was a big deal to see a deer. Yeah, right.
Early 30s too.
Well, you know, and people would go, I remember Mr. Wells saying, it was a big deal. They took their boys, they had 2 boys, and they took them out, and drove out to somewhere where they'd heard that there were deer to see them. That was in the 20s.
Carol, you had Kenneth Ward as president of the school board. Oswald J., the old man, was.
I don't think Kenneth was ever.
I don't think he was.
OJ.
Oswald.
His father.
Oswald J.
I can still hear him.
I can still hear him starting out over in the barnyard there with his car.
Flip the clutch.
Oh.
I wouldn't have known the name to make it.
He was deaf and he couldn't hear the engine. And
So-
Somebody might have been
Mel, did you want to open it up just for general remembrances or talking or whatever?
Yeah.
So if anybody
I-
has
I thought that's
anything
kind
they
of what
want
we
to
were,
share.
I thought that's what we were kind of doing. yeah.
Yes. Well,
Go ahead, Ed.
Yeah, one other thing I'd like to throw out, when I was going through the Owego Gazette, during that era, we came to September of 1929, I was kind of interested, well, what's the local reaction going to be to the stock market crash? And I didn't see anything. So I'm going through month after month after month, and I'm still not hearing any indication that, the rest of the country is experiencing pretty severe downturn. And then about a year later, this was in the fall of 1930, the first indication I saw was that the local farmers are not having as much trouble finding field hands because there's people coming up that need a job, and they just want a place where they can have a roof over their head and food in their stomachs. And so that was the first thing, the indication that something is amiss as far as the country's economy is concerned. And I was wondering if any of you, had something that grew up during that period that, suddenly made you realize that there's something wrong here. Or, you know, maybe there was, you know, some local farmers, all of a sudden, there were some extra field hands that showed up that maybe weren't locals, they were from other parts of the country.
I didn't see it.
The bank was very conservatively invested, so they lost practically nothing, where other banks lost a lot. Like $1,000, something to that effect.
Yeah, there was no bank insurance back then, as such, the way the Federal Reserve did.
No.
Of course, if a bank is very conservatively invested, that means when you go there, you don't get a loan. So, it works both ways.
Yeah.
What about the community club? Was that in the 40s or later?
That was later, Joe. Yeah, that was later. It was actually more active in the 50s.
One thing I was just discussing, you know, the Candor Dam, you know, been trying to get funding to get that repaired. In case, I don't know how many of you knew that, they are, the village is looking to get some money. They do have some money they got, but they're going out for more to repair that. And there's a committee that's getting together and getting those school kids, history school kids involved in the high school on helping out with that, and the coal barn. But I found that, I mentioned in here 1930s, they were working on it because it was leaking. They repaired it again in 1950. They again repaired it in 1972. And here we are, 20-some years later. Seems like it lasts maybe every 20 years. So I think one of the things they're thinking about doing is because they do want to keep it historically. They might do something like having concrete underneath and then just putting the wooden top on it. Instead of having the whole thing is wood.
Actually, it was a constant battle.
Pretty in
Well, yes, you
My
can tell
father
that.
worked for Warren Manscoy for a long time, and he was constantly working on that dam, replacing boards and toggling this and toggling that. It was an ongoing thing. It's made of wood. And every spring, there would be a big tree come down and lodge itself on the face of the, or up on the top of the dam. Then the water would begin to gouge down behind the roots. And the hydraulic effect of water is huge, as the folks who put those big blocks of stone in there found out. And my father would turn over in his grave if he could see that. But anyway, it was a constant battle to keep that dam in repair. It wasn't just every 20 years or so.
Right, but that's when the major
Oh, yeah.
repair was done
Yeah.
and money was raised.
Right.
So on to do that. I just found that
Well,
interesting.
Warden Van Scoy abandoned it and gave it to the village, and they had to do something about it. That was the gist of that. They weren't gonna fix it anymore, so Art Beebe and others decided, well, we're gonna raise money to fix it. In the 50s, when they had the Mardi Gras and all that stuff.
Speaking of water, did the flood of 35 have an impact over here in this valley?
Well, you know,
36.
there was, I think I took it out. This was like too many pages, I had to cut back. But there was mention of a flood. And I think that was, what year did you say? I thought it was around 35.
36.
35, yeah.
36.
Pardon?
36.
36? There was mention of a flood.
How high did it get?
How high did it get?
Did it get within the town?
Wasn't there as high as 72?
Oh, so it did.
Not here anyway.
North
The
Valley.
only thing I remember
North Valley.
Got a lot
was
worse
when
than
we
we
did
did.
the movies, it got down to the barns down in Catawba. And that's as far as you could go.
When was this, Mary Lou?
That was that flood of 35.
Of 30,
I was a kid when we were
35,
going,
36.
I was so excited going to the movies. Will Rogers movie.
Couldn't get there.
Stopped right there in has them, but we've got Candor, I don't remember.
Wouldn't have done anything good to
anything
get the
flooded.
wiggle anyway, that was all underwater.
What?
I say it wouldn't have done you any good to get the wiggle, that was all underwater.
Right.
There were two major floods in a row. Now, 35 was the one that really was the big one in North Valley.
Yeah.
I mean, they still have the high water mark on the bank.
Really?
You know, there was like about 6 feet of water in downtown North Valley in July of 35. And that was, I don't think anybody got killed, but there was people got killed in Lyle, Watkins Glen, Trumansburg, and then Shenango River, I think there was a lot of impact. In fact, I think that for that particular flood, the Susquehanna River was pushed back to Great Bend. That's how much water was coming down the Shenango River. And then 36 was another major flood, but that didn't have nearly as much impact, you know, on North Valley. I thought that was more the Susquehanna River. But
Was this a spring flood or?
the 36 was a spring flood, and then 35, it was just this massive downpour that came, you know, it was in the middle of the summer.
Right. I had a cousin in Elmira that drowned in the river during that flood.
35?
Yeah, 35.
I was in Elmira when the flood hit in 72.
Yeah.
Plenty of water.
My folks bought their house on Honeypot Road in 1936. There was 3 foot of water in the cellar when they bought it. And there was never any water in it until 1972. Again, there was 3 foot in 1972.
So that'd be groundwater.
Yeah, it comes out whenever it broke out up on the Honeypot, farther up, it come right down through the
Yeah,
field. That's
sure.
the times they got it.
Yeah.
But since 36, it's only had water in it twice. 36 and 72.
My parents used to talk about a flood. And it was my impression that it did flood the village somewhere. And I lived down towards the Baptist church. But apparently it did not. Plus, that was a while ago.
I don't, in going through the paper, I don't know about you, Don, but I really haven't found a whole lot about the floods. I mean, there might be
I don't
mention
think
of
it
them, but it just.
affected Candor as much as it did North Valley, for
Yeah,
instance.
it's just not a whole
Candor's
lot.
far enough above.
Even 72 wasn't as
No, not
disastrous in Candor as it was in many others.
Down the road a ways.
Wilkes-Barre down that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How many mills were still operational in the 1930s in this branch of the Weaver Creek?
Oh,
Did you mention that there was still a grist mill operational?
Well, there were 2 grist mills. That was it.
Catatonia, anything?
Catatonia had a sawmill. Sawmill and.
In the ground feed.
They used water power. Up the road, nothing up the road.
No other sawmills that I know
Does anybody remember the transient camps during the 30s? I didn't know about it. Of course, I've been doing some reading on the 30s in connection with the Civilian Conservation Corps. And I found an article on transient camps, and that was the people that were, that had lost their jobs and were moving. They were moving around the country, trying to find whatever they could, anywhere they could, and they moved in and out of towns, and of course they were moved out as quickly as they moved in. Anyway, during the flood, after the transit camps were established by government order, they used a lot of those people to clean up areas that had been affected by the flood of 35.
Do you think some of these were the farmers coming to work on the farms and stuff too, or were they different people? Don't you know? From your research?
Yeah, they could, yeah, sure. That's
Every say.
what I think a lot of them did. They tried to find work wherever they could.
Were they there very long, Mary Lou?
No.
There wasn't any 30s.
Just came and went?
When was that? That was.
From Curtis Harmon had the farm, and that, so that was in the 50s.
That was the gypsies used to come.
Gypsies, yeah.
Yeah, they used to come about once a year. come through.
Art went down and talked to him, so there must have been something to Courier about it.
Or in the gypsy roll.
It was just mentioned.
Did
There's a
they
few of
camp
them.
on Harmon's or actually
Yeah.
Russian camp? At
In
Harmon's?
between Harmon's and the
on-
creek.
On Harmon's land.
down next to the creek.
Opposite of Jimmy Luciani's hog lot.
I know where it is.
I can remember occasionally there would be a hobo going on the main road. We lived on the main road, and then occasionally somebody would stop and wanna do some work in exchange for food. Maybe they chop wood or whatever.
Sharp
I
lines.
I think mother always gave them something to eat whether they worked or not, but
I always thought they came by the train, but I don't know why.
Well, a lot of them did.
I remember them coming to the back
I'm
door.
not sure in Candor, I mean, there's no way of knowing, but, they had their own little signs and cigarettes and stuff that they had all over the place.
Susie had a mark on it, see, that's what happened.
Uh-oh.
On her back door, that's why they came.
They would put them there, if they got a handout
Yeah.
someplace or.
I've read that,
you know,
yeah.
Places where to go, where not to go.
But as a kid, I can remember strangers coming to the back door.
Somebody must have left some kind of mark. But that was a good place to go, if you needed someplace to stay or
Now,
food.
since we're reminiscing, I can remember when the Catatump Valley was clouded with smoke or something. As a young kid, you couldn't, I lived sort of in the middle of the valley, you couldn't see either side of the hill. Now, what, was that a storm? What was that?
forest fires.
Right up on the hill.
Probably
Yeah,
forest.
it was
trains
something
used to
like
sit.
that,
I think it was bigger.
Fires,
It totally filled the valley.
Would that have been in the wartime, about 42 or 43?
No, I think it was after. I think I was younger.
Because that whole hillside burned off up here in the 40s. Everybody was gone in the war.
Yeah.
Clear up where Dickman Square lives now, that was all burned off.
Narrows up there, Herb Barrows lives at.
That would burn
Constantly
quite
was
off.
being touched off by sparks from the train at Side Hill.
This was probably in the late 30s.
Yeah.
Well, there were a lot of fires that were set off by locomotives back off and on. I don't know.
If it was smoke, you'd smell it though.
I didn't
You
find
were a
that
little
they
kid
actually had
and
everything.
if
I was
you saw-
especially,
If you
I
saw
was
a little
especially-
You only was a
smoke,
fine
that
guy.
that was a lot.
I've come through there and it's so dark, you know, I had to roll the window down and look out to see where I was going. It'd get pretty foggy down through there.
We got a lot of smoke from the fires in Michigan one year.
All the way from Michigan.
A lot of fires in
The wind
Michigan.
was blowing just right.
Comes that way.
Well, yes, we get winds from there, and I know that because one time I found a bunch of balloons down in the cotton. I had some beef cows in. This bunch of balloons was caught in the fence, and the cows were sniffing it. And I went down, and it was a kindergarten class in Miami school in Michigan. Had set it up, and it took about, well, I discovered it probably about 24 hours after they put it up in Michigan, so it obviously has been up high enough so that the balloons burst, shattered rather than just popped. The shards were like this, so the balloon had been up high enough and cold enough, so when it broke, it just shattered rather than popped like the balloon does now when it's warm.
I know one thing I read, was the summer of '35, that you could see some of the dust from one of the storms out west,
Oh.
during the Dust Bowl.
Dust, Dust Bowl.
Yeah, that you could see that there's a coloring in the clouds here. There's so much dust that it got out this way.
Ruth Miller used to tell me about dances that they had up would be above La George's store. She used to play the piano there for them.
Candor Town Hall.
That must have been, that must have been in.
Who
the
played them?
30s.
Who played the
Well, it
piano?
was Ruth Miller,
Ruth Miller?
yeah, Cilla Ward's mother.
She also played for the Silent Kings.
Oh, yeah.
Did she? Yeah, for the silent film?
Well, she was born in 1900, so.
She played by ear, she didn't never guitar.
Oh, really? I
And Maine Twiller, you remember her? She used to play for the Sound.
She might have been able to beat it.
Need a sharp?
Yep.
Sharp?
I got some old,
Albert Kilpatrick?
shoe sheets
Chili.
that came from the movies. 'Cause they
He played
showed a
too?
few bars of what
Elmer
they
plays?
were
Elmer,
supposed to
oh,
play.
he had his own band.
Yeah.
Was on the screen.
He had his own orchestra
Wow.
for a time. Yeah.
Chase Senior or something like that.
Oh,
Uh,